Hello, my name is Susanne Evans and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. This is a podcast for people who are interested in creating change, whether that is within organisations or for individuals. In each podcast episode, I will have a conversation with someone about their work to share their story. Each story and conversation will provide you with ideas and inspiration for your own organisation or for you personally. To find out more about each episode, including further reading, and to share your change stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. My guest today is Susan Ní Chríodáin from Beyond the Numbers. Susan has led and managed teams for over 20 years, including cross-cultural, cross-functional and remote teams in Europe and Africa. Her distinctive energy is her optimism in the face of uncertainty and complexity, and her rare ability of being as good with people as details. Susan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Susanne, I am absolutely delighted to be here with you.
Well, you're so welcome, and it's so lovely to speak to you. I know we've spoken many times, and I've had the pleasure of being on your podcast too. But it's lovely to have a bit of time together to unpick some of the things that you're doing and the things that you're working on. And I sort of alluded to your career in the introduction, but I don't think it really did you justice because you've had a really varied career up to now. So I thought maybe to start with, how did you get to where you are now? You know, what are the different things that you have done in your life that have led you to the work that you're now doing?
Oh my God, how long have you got? Well, actually, it is kind of a fascinating story in one way. So I will try and do the highlights, and please stop me if I go on too long. But the interesting thing is when I was in school, and I'm going right back, I wanted to be a PE teacher. You know, I wanted to be a sports teacher, a coach, effectively, because I was in the athletics club and I loved working with people to get them to figure out how to run better or faster or whatever it was. And that kind of, you've got it in you. How do you bring it out? And in Ireland, it wasn't, there was like 20 places for somebody to do something like that. There was only one university that had a course like that. And I didn't get in after doing the equivalent of A-levels. And so I took a year out because everybody said, if you reapply, they'll know you're serious and they'll give it to you next year, you know. Where that logic came from, I'm not sure. And at 17, you're like, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. And I did a computer course that year, which was in MS-DOS, if you believe
my word.
It was way back when. And the only thing that I missed from school, get this, was accountancy. So I loved numbers. I had this love of numbers as well as people. And they made sense to me. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I actually think it's because they tell a story. So you get this puzzle with numbers that if you can put them together and explain the story of what's going on, it's a different dimension. It's a different way of looking at the same piece of information. And I think I've always been fascinated by that. So the year went and I studied commerce and I joined Deloitte & Touche out of university. Well, actually, I didn't because I was supposed to do a master's of accounting. I didn't get the points, so they couldn't take me for a year. And I did women's studies for a year.
Oh,
yeah.
That's different, right?
Completely. And now for something completely different. And the reason I did it was they had no exams on the course. And it was a master's that had 2 hours a week or something, or it was a postgraduate diploma and it had 4 hours a week. But it was phenomenal, actually, Susanne, because I learned about women in history and witchcraftism and women and the law and all of these things that were actually really important that I may never have actually had an understanding of. And I also probably learned to write for the first time. You know, okay, it was academic writing, but in commerce, you didn't have to write anything really, you know, whereas this was more essays and so on. Anyway, I went into Deloitte. I did my 3.5 years with them. I left my personal stuff at the door, as we did in those days, and became an auditor, blended in with the crowd. And but I always wanted something else. I was never really that satisfied with what I was doing, and maybe because it was kind of boring. But anyway, I went off to Australia in 2000 when most people were going from Ireland at that time. There's a lot of people that went to Australia, did a working holiday out there, but ended up staying there for 2 years actually, and then travelled and worked and came back to Ireland in early 2002. And I really wanted to see more of the world. I think that's what Australia had done for me, was opened my eyes. And, you know, when they say travel broadens the mind, it sounds like a cliche, but it is, because it's true. Yeah. And the Australians had a really great way of a work ethic, where they left work at the door at 5 o'clock and they went home and they enjoyed the outdoors. And it was real outdoor living there. And in Ireland, work was kind of everything. That's how it felt. Mm. Whereas in Australia, work was something people did to live.
Right.
And that was really nice. So when I came back to Ireland, I was like, yeah, I need more of that. I need to travel. So I volunteered with an Irish organisation called GOAL, International Humanitarian Organisation. And I went to Africa, to Uganda with them for 2 years as a finance person. And, you know, everything changes. Your whole reality shifts when you do something like that, because I used to have to send the accounts to Dublin by going to a local internet cafe.
Remember them?
Yeah, I know. And we had load shedding. So we would have no electricity for maybe 8 hours one day and then overnight the next night, and so on like that for weeks on end. And it really made you focus on what mattered. What's right in front of me now? What's the here and now, I suppose? And maybe that was the start of learning some of these things, but, you know, it stays with me, and what matters most, I suppose. And I did that for 2 years, and then I did a roving role with them. So I spent a lot of time in and out of parts of East Africa. I went to Sri Lanka after the tsunami in 2005, Jan 2005. I went to Pakistan to respond after the earthquake later that year. And after living out of a suitcase for a very long time, I thought, okay, it's time to do something else. And I relocated back to Ireland and actually got a job in Manchester as a finance director at 33 for an international organisation that cleared landmines and unexploded ordnance.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, the Mines Advisory Group, which, you know, we talk about trust in the workplace, and this for me is a great example of having trust in your employees. I went to a minefield in Cambodia with them, and we cleared landmines, you know, so the place would get marked off, cordoned off as it had been cleared. So there would be what they would call a cleared path.
Yeah.
And I put on all of my PPE, the, you know, specialist equipment, face covered, a vest, a bulletproof vest or whatever, that kind of thing, you know, and all the important bits covered, basically. Yeah. And we got to the minefield and stood on the edge of it, and we'd had a briefing, a safety briefing by the lead deminer. And then it was like, okay, follow me and I will guide you safely to the other side. But taking that first step onto that cleared path was quite anxious. You know, I was quite anxious because, yeah, I trusted him, but like, what if they missed a spot?
Yeah, I can't imagine what that must have been like. That must have been absolutely terrifying.
And yet we got it to the other side. And then you start to learn about that work. And, you know, that field, actually that morning in Cambodia, I remember we talked to some of the locals, and there was another field kind of across the way that had been cleared 10 years earlier or something. And a school had been built there. And one of the children from that school, so maybe it was later on or whatever, but he had gotten the top results in the equivalent of the A levels in Cambodia the year he did those exams. And isn't that just phenomenal to think that, you know, there was no school there, and then suddenly this kid gets that opportunity? And yeah, that's amazing. That's impact.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I mean, it's within just those few years, you've did so many things, more than most people would do in a lifetime, I'm sure. How was all of those experiences? How do you put them into your work now? Because I know a lot of your work is around emotion and helping people to express themselves and sort of opening up conversations in organizations. How do you use all of that when you work with people?
Well, I think what's interesting about that, because I'm just going to keep going slightly to say next, after I finished with them, I did a master's in nationalism and ethnic conflict, which taught me a lot about identity. And I think that helped me to start to understand people and how we behave and so on, and opened this whole window that moved me out of finance and into people effectively. And that's what I did. I spent 6 years then working, I suppose 3 years as a director who had responsibility for country directors in 5 in Africa and 5 in Asia. And I was based in Geneva then. And that was when I really started to learn more about people and coaching and facilitating, because I was kind of sat in the middle of all these technical people and then the people that were implementing. And I had to really learn how to navigate through technical spaces with people who only spoke technically almost, and translate that into day-to-day activities. And I dealt with a lot of egos, people that were sciencey, and it's not just science people, believe me, that have egos, but, they were very dedicated to what they were doing and needed everything done exactly right, and got very upset when things didn't go their way. And then you're dealing with the reality on the ground in somewhere like Bangladesh, where the government says, well, you can't do that here. We're not going to tolerate that, or whatever. And I guess between a lot of observation over the years, a lot of cross-cultural work, you just build up more of a repertoire, perhaps, of how people behave and react, and you learn to navigate it in a different way. And I think that's what I did. I became more and more competent, I would say, at facilitating conversations, at getting people to sort out in front of them or together what they really wanted to talk about with clarity, allow the expectations to be revealed and not just huff and puff and run away. And I think a lot of the time I used to think that the work that when I was at the Minds Advisory Group, people died if you didn't follow protocol. It was life and death work. And nothing else really is.
No, that's true. And I think so often in organisations that it's sort of forgotten, isn't it, that everyone treats everything as though it's life and death if it's done or if it isn't. But actually a lot of the time it's simply not true for most people's work. If you don't do this thing, it might not be great, but no one's going to die if you don't do this thing properly. And
exactly.
That kind of perspective is important, isn't it?
And that is what I would say to people. Is anyone going to die as a result of this not getting done?
Yeah.
And they kind of look at me for a while. And after a while, people used to say, I know what you're going to say now. But because, in a country office, when you're implementing overseas and you're dealing with the head office, who's often, full of the technical people telling you what to do, and then the government, you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place often, especially with nutrition interventions that can be very, very sensitive. And being able to alleviate the stress of the people responsible, that's what I saw my job as. That's what I saw my role as that safe space that this very senior individual, this country director, would come and say to me, I'm struggling to do this, or I can't figure out what to do next, or I'm working 70 hours a week and I'm going to collapse. And I think when you focus on the human in front of you and what they need, and you allow them to speak to what they need, it can have a profound effect on that person's life. And you may not have to do a whole lot, but listening and deep listening is undervalued.
Yeah, I agree. I think we talk about listening. There's a lot of talk that goes on in organisations, but not much conversation, I would say. It's lots of people talking and being noisy without actually people listening and that deep listening that you talk about.
Yeah. And then bringing people together. So I think that was the other thing, you'll have silos in a larger organisation. How do you keep those silos? They're so hard to eliminate, but can you at least get people to see that they're all working together? They're all on the same team. And I think having a role like I had, I wasn't in HR, I wasn't in finance, I was operational. So I was kind of going across a bunch of different teams. It allowed me to bring people together and set up workshops, facilitate conversations and workshops with the wider organization at times, that we could broach things that were important to everyone and not just focus on the technical people who are often seen as gods, or, on the country people or whatever. But I suppose it's not so much, it is empathy in a way, getting people to see the perspective of others. But you need to go beyond that, and you need to help people understand the pain that other people are experiencing because of the way they behave at times, or because of their agenda being driven home. And it was quite delicate and sensitive. And I think I got better and better at it. And I enjoyed it. I like that. I like being able to facilitate people and get them to let their guard down and get them to be human together.
I'm really interested actually in that process of learning how to do that, because it sounds as though you sort of learned as you went along and got better, as you said, at doing these things. Was it a conscious decision that you made to work on this stuff, or was it just something that happened out of necessity?
With the benefit of hindsight, I can't even tell you. But I actually think it goes way back, Susanne. And I think, all of us, who we become or who we are today is rooted in something else, isn't it? I suppose. Yes. And if I look back, the day before my 4th birthday, my mother gave birth to my sister Aoife. And Aoife was born seriously physically and mentally disabled. And so it was a big shock. And my brother was 1 at the time. And obviously I don't really remember. I remember her not being there for my 4th birthday, interestingly enough, but I don't remember the birth and all of that and the fuss afterwards. And my sister was in and out of hospital for that first year a lot. And a couple of years ago, my mother told me that when we had no phone, we were in rural Ireland. My dad was at work, he had the car, and my sister got really ill. And my mother said she needed her mother. And my grandmother lived, maybe 400 meters down the road, or 500 meters, or 3 fields actually. And my mother said she had to ask me as a 4-year-old child to go and fetch her mother.
Wow.
And she said she watched me walk down through the fields, across each wall and everything to get safely into the house down the road, down below, as we used to call it, and get my grandmother and bring her back. And my mom said within a few more times of this happening, she no longer had to ask me, that I knew I needed to go and fetch grandma, and I would say to her, I'm going now to get grandma. So I think I grew up, or, that responsibility at a very young age made me very conscious of what was going on, dynamics in a room. And I think dynamics have always fascinated me. And maybe as I grew older, I realized that not everyone picked up on dynamics in a room. And I think you know, I don't know, it's hard to know, isn't it? Because when it's you don't really know. But I do know that when it came to something like a difficult conversation, and when I say a difficult conversation, I mean the first time I had to fire someone. And I had to fire someone first in Uganda. And, you know, I'm firing somebody who was probably earning $400 or $500 a month. And that was probably feeding a family. And there was part of me who just did not want to have that conversation or do it. But then there was the part of me who knew that this person had been stealing from us. And therefore, this was the best course or only course of action. But I felt so nervous about it. You know, I really felt like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And I remember going to my boss and saying to him, you know, this is how I feel. And he said to me, well, if you felt any other way, Susan, I wouldn't really be happy about it because you're human.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, okay, so this is how I'm supposed to feel, I think. And I went in and I did that, and I fired the guy, and I can still see his face, honestly, Susanne, now, you know, nearly 20 years later. And it was heartbreaking. And I did it again, and other people, over and over. I've had many of these quite tense at time conversations. But I realized that those inner sensations, that like gut churning or sweaty palms or frequent trips to the loo, whenever it was, that I needed that to go in there and show up properly. Yes. But once I got in the door, I needed to focus on the person in front of me and let go of my agenda other than deliver those words, "You're fired," or whatever. Yes. You know, and then respond to whatever came at me. And there's something exhilarating about that. And I don't mean that like an adrenaline junkie, I want to go around the world firing people, but it's kind of like a dance, isn't it, between two people, that as long as I could remain calm on the outside and focus on the person in front of me and respond to them, then I could get through it.
Yes. And there's so many interesting points in what you've just talked about. I mean, the story about you as a four-year-old is just amazing, and I'm sure has played a part in well, it will have done in who you are now and the work that you do. But I find it really fascinating that you kind of knew how to do this without anybody telling you, but also that boss that you had gave you the permission to feel as you felt. And I think often in organisations, and when, you know, we have these conversations about having difficult conversations or giving bad news, we almost don't talk enough about the fact that you will feel this stuff. And if you don't feel it, you're probably in the wrong job. You know, if you're quite happy to fire people, you shouldn't be firing people, because you won't be doing it in a way that's respectful and human. But how amazing that your boss said that to you, because I wonder if he hadn't, what the outcome might have been, or whether the way that you handled it would have been really different.
It would have been a disaster, probably.
Yeah.
You know? And it's interesting you say that, because I know I have given that kind of advice. In fact, the last person I fired, which wasn't that long ago, it was my last role, so it's not that long ago, but I brought one of them more junior, and I say that in a nice way, you know, she's just like, she was younger and everything in and had a different role, but I brought her in with me. And I can remember her being terrified and, you know, saying to her, it's okay to feel like this, you know, I'm taking the lead, you're here as a witness, and she was part of the legal team and whatever. But she reminded me, I suppose, of that first time I had to do it. But after that person was let go, that person, you know, I had to hang around with them while they cleared their desk and do all of that stuff. And, you know, it's all very, very tense and uncomfortable. And, you know, the person is usually in a state of shock. And that person, before they left the office, they turned to me, they gave me a hug, their personal phone number and their personal email address, and said, you know, thank you for doing that and leaving me with my dignity.
How amazing. That's it. I mean, that's incredible. How often that very rarely happens, I'm sure, in those circumstances. I think that's incredible. And so I'm thinking, as you're talking, that the experience that you had, and you were sharing it with your colleague who was less experienced, but how can organisations get more comfortable with this idea of feelings at work? Because you talked earlier about kind of leaving your personal stuff at the door in your earlier career, and I think we've got a bit better at that. COVID has kind of opened up people's personal lives and all that sort of thing, but I still think there's so many people who are really uncomfortable with emotion and are afraid of it. How can we get people to feel more comfortable and know that everyone has feelings, and you're just as likely to have a feeling at work as you are at home?
Well, you can't really do anything without a feeling. I mean, obviously, there's feelings happening here while we're talking. Yeah. But I'm just so glad you asked me that question. Because I am going to write a book. Well,
we have talked briefly about your book, but I think it's really needed, because this is the stuff that gets in the way, isn't it, of people doing great work.
It's fascinating. So the working title of my book, and honestly, I haven't written a word of it yet, and I'm still wondering how on earth I'm going to do it. But just having this conversation is giving me that kind of, ooh, yes, come on, as well. But the working title is This Feelings Business.
Oh.
And then How Accounting for Emotions Tips the Balance at Work.
Nice. I like that.
And what I want to do, and I suppose if we think of it this way, right, this is what I'm going to say, is that earlier this year, actually, let's just take Twitter. Let's just take Twitter now. But Twitter sold to Elon Musk very recently for $44 billion.
Yeah.
What is that made up of? Like, what is that $44 billion? Can I touch it? Can I feel it? I bet you that only 10%, 15 maybe % of that is on their balance sheet, is tangible, right? And the rest of it is intangible. And just because that's intangible, that 30-something billion, does it mean that we ignore it? Absolutely not. It's what's driving the share price. It's what's driving everything. Now take a person. All right, you sit down in front of a person and you see the outward, you see what their face is showing you. And we are very, very good at masking, some better than others, but we're very good at pretending that how I look is how I feel. And so the tangible is maybe my tone of voice, or I know you can't touch that, but at least you can hear it,
Yes.
And the intangible is what's going on inside. So should we ignore that? Absolutely not. Because we talk about engagement in the workplace or disengagement or whatever it is. I mean, there's so many different terms now, quiet quitting, all of these things. They're all feelings. As is belonging. How do you know you belong? You feel like you belong. How do you know you're engaged? You feel it. How do you know you're excited? You feel it. How do you know you love your job? You feel it. And they're the things that employers and employees, this is not just for employers, but it's the stuff we need to start talking about and saying, you know what, I feel uncomfortable doing this part of my job. Can somebody help me? Or I'm afraid to go into a meeting with Susanne because the last time she threw a stapler at me or whatever.
Right. It could happen.
But, and I think it's like, and I suppose for organizations now, Susanne, what can they do? I think there is bound to be at least one person in the organization that has a bit more competence or confidence around naming feelings and is a bit more emotionally stable, emotionally secure, emotionally mature, whatever the term you want to use. And if that person can speak up and out, they can help create a revolution and call this stuff out in a way. And I think that's what I always did. I was comfortable as well, being vulnerable and being open, not not about everything, but certainly enough that I would talk about stuff that people might not want to talk about. And once that seal is broken, it's a bit like the Pringles, once you pop, you cannot stop. And it's not that we want to sit around and be crying or any of that kind of nonsense. And I shouldn't say it like that. I don't mean it like that at all. What I mean is emotions are part of what we are. Every single interaction with another human being is an emotional transaction.
Yes. And I think the point you made there about sitting around crying, for me, that's the bit that stops people from being too vulnerable, because they're afraid of going too far, and it becomes everyone's expected to share everything, or they have to reveal everything of themselves. And of course, that's just not true. We often don't reveal all of ourselves to anybody, or to only a few very close people. But as a leader, I think what you said about vulnerability is really important. And by making that first move, it shows other people that it's okay to have feelings and to be vulnerable and to have flaws, all of these things, which are really important.
Totally. And I think that we are talking about it more, and certainly, obviously, I'm researching stuff and all of that at the moment. But, there are some really great people out there. Like there's Susan Davis. She's a Harvard person, and she has written a book called Emotional Agility. And that's a really helpful book, I think, on understanding that emotions are data. They're information. And just because they feel whatever way to you, it doesn't mean that they're true.
Yes.
And I think even knowing that you can control them, that we actually have the power to change it, to reframe it, to think about it differently, to pause. Actually, the pause is probably the most powerful thing in the world, I think. Pause, silence, and going through it is better than ignoring it.
Yes. And I love the fact that you mentioned pause, because I bang on about that reflective practice all the time in my work. But there's no time to pause in organisations. It's been like this for quite a long time. I think it's actually getting worse. You look at people's diaries and it's meeting, one after the other. No time to reflect, no time to notice what's going on for them, what's going on in their team. And it's not a good way to work, both as an individual, but also as an organisation as a whole.
No, and this, it is a kind of a feverish thing, isn't it? This busyness. And I mean, we don't want to pause, I think, Susanne, as well. I don't think we want the silence. We want the spaces filled. So we just keep going on this kind of treadmill of busyness or whatever. But there's another great book as well it's written by Professor Mark Brackett, and he is head of the Center for Emotional Intelligence at Yale. And his book is Permission to Feel. And it's written, I think, a lot. It's about work and yourself, but also if you have children. I think, I don't have kids, but for people that have children, I think it's probably really good in a way to help them to express. And he has this technique, the ruler technique, and ruler is an easy thing to remember. And, it's about recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and then reframing.
Oh.
And, and I suppose what he's doing is giving us permission to feel and permission to see that we are feeling beings and we need it. And I think that's what I like about what he says about work, is that actually when you're motivated to learn is when you learn. We don't learn because somebody makes us learn. We learn because we want to learn. And that's desire, and that's a feeling. And we remember stuff that's important to us because we felt something. And I think when you start to, and innovation, when you start to think about all of these things that require us to feel good physically, I would say, like good sleep, good nutrition, all of those kinds of things, but also feel strong in ourselves, competent, confident, and the ability to be disagreed with in public and not feel like running away. To actually like raise issues or suggest things and make it a bit fun and playful and have laughter and the feelings that evokes. And I suppose we're kind of tied up with this whole thing of professionalism, meaning I must be serious at work. And it's so not true.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I've been accused of not being serious enough in the past. And I think I am serious. I'm serious about my work, but I don't take myself seriously. I think that's the difference. That I think you work a really long time. And if you're going to be miserable the whole time you're there, that's not good for you. And it's also not good for the people around you. So you have to have fun. There has to be enjoyment. And I really like what you were saying there about things like innovation. How many organisations have you come across who some senior person declares we're going to focus on innovation this year, but there's no kind of, how do you make people want to do that? There's no focus on that. People are just told we have to be innovative. Well, no one's going to do that, are they? Because as you say, they won't have the desire, they won't have the feeling or the motivation around it. So that's never going to happen.
No, and what's worse, I think, is probably, maybe the younger people who are fresh and coming in with ideas will be like, yay, this is brilliant, because they haven't been wound or worn down by the institution yet. And their ideas will be dismissed because they won't have come from the top. Or they'll be kind of, oh, you don't know, you haven't been here long enough and all of that kind of thing. Because I suppose we get a bit entrenched into our ways, don't we? We become a bit predictable, and innovation isn't about predictability, and innovation is about being free to experiment and to try new things. And we'll come at it going, well, how does that work? How are you going to make that work? Which is more like, okay, hold on a second. It's just an idea.
Yeah.
Let's explore. And we want everything to be done today and delivered tomorrow. Life doesn't work like that.
No, it gets in the way. And I suppose going back to what you said right at the beginning about being interested in story and numbers of story, and obviously I do a lot of work around stories, and I think there's a link here, isn't there, between engaging people, having them have feelings about something, and you can do that through telling a story about this thing. So if you want your organisation to be more innovative, rather than just telling people they have to be innovative, you have to engage them in the process. And you can do that by telling them a story about what this new world will look like, or, some of the other innovative things that have happened in the organisation, and sort of holding people up as exemplars. And that's, I think, where it sort of links together, the story and the emotion. You create emotion by telling a story.
Absolutely. And I think your podcast has had some fantastic guests talking about storytelling with you. And, at times we get a bit het up, don't we? Is this story correct? Do I need to do this with it? And just talk, just tell the story. And of course, if you want to bring a whole organization with you, that's a bit different. But you're only ever going to get good at storytelling by telling stories.
Yes.
Isn't it? It's practice like anything else. And everything we do, there's a story, and it does something. I was listening to one of your guests who said, I think it must have been Angus Fletcher, that we don't even know how it impacts the brain yet, but it does.
Yes.
The stories resonate. They get us to do things. They're change makers. And the last thing anyone wants to do is sit in a presentation and watch PowerPoint slides with loads of text and loads of data. We want to feel like we're going somewhere with you. We want to know where we are and where we're going, and maybe how we're going to get there. But, I work with people who are like, I want to bring in this improvement plan. And I say, well, if you want an improvement plan, you're basically telling everybody that's working there now that what they're doing isn't good enough.
Yeah.
And I would much prefer that you come up with with your plan for the future. Your future plan. What are we working towards? What do we want? And it's like, okay, but I need to say we're going to improve things. And I'm like, well, let's just keep that away for the moment. we need to bring people with us first. And I think we just get very tick boxy about stuff and checklisty. And we forget about that there are a group of humans in front of us who want to be told a story.
Yes. Yes, and I think it's so true. And I think the other thing that gets in our way sometimes is this desire to have everything right before we tell anyone. So I've worked on a project in the past. It was an IT implementation, so there was obviously change around it, and there was this real tension between people wanting to know things. So people in the organisation, how's this going to affect my day-to-day life? And then the people on the project saying, well, we can't tell you yet because we don't know what the system's going to look like. And me in the middle saying, well, we have to be able to tell them something. They don't have to see what the page is going to look like that they're going to open. But can we explain to them what it's going to feel like to be in this new place, what it's going to look like, how their day is going to change. But I think often this desire to be right gets in the way of having these conversations about, actually, we don't know all the answers, but we're going to tell you what we know now.
Well, fear of the unknown as well, isn't it? People just don't want to say, I don't know as well, first of all. And then kind of like, well, this is what we're hoping or whatever. I don't know. The right first time, I remember like in university having a module, which was total quality management. And we had just this right first time thing drummed into us. And so there are a generation of people who've got this right first time nonsense. And like, are we ever right? And who's right and who's wrong? And is it my right or your right? There's so many things that we just don't know, and things evolve.
Yes.
And so this is our plan now. This is what we think it might look like. And we'll come back to you if that changes.
Yeah.
And we'll bring you with us. And I suppose people maybe we're just afraid we're going to get asked lots of questions we can't answer.
Yes.
That's really what it comes down to. And rather than just going, well, I can't answer that, like, what's going to happen?
Yeah. What's the worst thing that's going to happen if someone asks you a question you don't know?
Yeah. Well, anyone die as a result of you not knowing this.
Exactly. You just say, I don't know, but I'll find out for you. And then you go away.
Yeah.
And I think, going back to what you said right at the start, it's about recognising that you are a person and you have another person in front of you or a group of people in front of you, and you just focus not on you and how you feel about it, but on what they are and what they need.
Absolutely. It's not your agenda.
No.
You have an agenda to get through something, but make it as simple as possible and prepare. And be willing to throw everything out the window and just go with the person in front of you, which I think, Susanne, is very much what coaching is about. And that's why I really enjoy coaching, because I can show up and be there for this person in front of me and support them and listen deeply. And it will go where it goes. It's not my agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the joy of coaching sometimes and working one-to-one, isn't it? That you have no idea what's going to happen, and you have to just be open to that in the moment, that it may not end up how you thought it would, and that's okay.
It's absolutely fine. And I think for people who don't really know, like, are afraid of maybe exploring something like that and what am I going to say and then it's about finding the person who you feel safe with.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing about coaching, isn't it? You want to connect with someone. You want to feel like you're in relationship, and therefore you will relate to that person. And you can open up then, and that's where the magic happens.
Absolutely. So I know you're working on your book, even though you said you haven't written any yet, but I know that that's going to happen very soon. What else are you doing at the moment? What sort of work are you doing right now?
So, well, I have my podcast as well, obviously, Susanne.
Which is brilliant.
Life Beyond the Numbers. And Susanne and I had a conversation, episode 83, if anyone wants to listen to that. And so I do some facilitation of workshops with people, generally to try and, if there's some sort of change being brought about, or just bringing a group together, whether that's a team or an organisation. I do some leadership development with another colleague of mine, and we train middle managers. I shouldn't say train, it's more facilitation, middle management on, because that's quite a tricky place to be in, because you're stuck between the people on top and the people underneath. And I think you have to know yourself quite well in a role like that. So we do some leadership development and coaching. So I suppose with me, my kind of coaching philosophy is accompanying people on their quest to deepen their relationship to themselves and to others.
I mean, it sounds like you have a very interesting time of it, I think, by the sounds of it.
No, I love it. I mean, like the ability to be able to work for myself, I think, and you would know this as you're self-employed as well. It's a privilege.
It genuinely is, I think, a joy.
It is.
But also makes you unemployable. But, that's
okay.
That's fine. I don't want to be employed. So if people want to find out more about you and your work, where's the best place for them to take a look?
Well, I suppose LinkedIn, you could start with LinkedIn and my Susan Ní Chríodáin. I'm probably the only one, so it's usually easily found. And then my website, beyondthenumbers.com.
Fabulous. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today, as ever. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you, Susanne. And we went completely in a different direction. It's so interesting, but it's fascinating to pull these pieces out every now and then and remind yourself of where you've come from.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Change Stories podcast. I love this conversation and I hope you did too. Thanks as ever to my wonderful guests and to Pete Morgan at Monkey Pants Productions for making the podcast sound amazing. If you want to find out more about this or any other episodes of Change Stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk, where you will find all the episodes and show notes. If you have enjoyed listening, please rate and review the Change Stories podcast on your podcast listening platform. And do please let me know if you have ideas or requests for future episodes. You can contact me and find out more about change and storytelling on my website, www.feldsparconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining in with the Change Stories conversation.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.